Welcome to this session. This is a session on vulnerabilities in solar panel controllers. I'm Waylon Grange. I am a principal threat researcher at State 2 Security. So I kind of do this as my day job. And this is just kind of a talk. I'm going to talk particularly about vulnerabilities in solar panels, and I'm going to use one case study as an example here. And then I'll just highlight the vulnerabilities in this case study and tell you which ones are kind of systematic across IoT that we see versus unique to this particular vendor. So just a little background to this story on what got me on this research initially. Last year, found myself with a little bit more extra free time when I was at home. And so I was looking for a project to work on, something to do. And around that same time, my neighbor installed a new solar panel system. And as he was telling me about a system, a lot of little red flags showed up in my mind, and I wanted to check out how secure his system was. So add the two together, and that's kind of how we got to where we are today. So just as a fair shot, I didn't single out this vendor for any other reason other than that's the vendor my neighbor had, and so that's what I figured I would look at. And so with that kind of background, I just take a quick look at things. So when we do our research on these projects, the first thing we always do is open source research, right? We try to figure out as far as we can go before we even touch any type of embedded device. Just try to find out what we can on the internet, get a hold of firmware images if we can, and start looking that way. So as an overview, this is taken from the Enphase's own marketing material, and this is their overview of their system. So highlighting the things that were interesting to me is that it's got a very large cloud component. It also is accessible via your iPad. So it's got some kind of application that interfaces with the device in the cloud. And it is installed via a mobile application. So that was really an interesting point to me, that all the installation of setup's done via a web-based app. And as you look at the graph, you've got your solar panels, you've got your batteries, they highlight the connector for some reason, but all of it is controlled. The main brains behind it is over there on the left side, that little Enphase IQ or Enphase IQ combiner. That device right there is really the heart of the system that monitors power consumption, power production, and then communicates this information up to the cloud. It's what the Enphase installer toolkit communicates with, and it's what reports the data that ultimately ends up in your iPad application. So that device is kind of the heart, kind of the target of this research. And so the first thing we want to do is we want to get the firmware image, a copy of the firmware image for that device. So I did a lot of open source research. I was checking out their sites, trying to find the firmware images that maybe you download and update or whatever. But I was unable to find that firmware image posted anywhere publicly, which is hats off to the vendors. Protecting the firmware images really goes a long way to keep their devices secure. So I went with the next best thing, is that I downloaded the apps and started reverse engineering those applications. So here's the apps that they have. They have the installer toolkit and the Enlighten Manager. And both of these apps are actually just mono based applications that are either ported to iOS or Android. And so most of the code's written in C#, so it's fairly easy to reverse and start looking at. However, what I found inside the app itself is that for all password-related functions, it would call down to a native binary that's been compiled for whatever architecture it's running on. And whenever I see something that, it's always a great interest as a pen tester, right? When you do mobile app pen testing, you see this a lot where, and I can't speak for the author, but what it appears to be going on is the author knows that these apps can be easily reverse engineered, right? Java, .NET can be reverse engineered very easily. And so it's easy for an attacker to see what's going on. And if they have something they want to hide or protect, then they think, well, I'm going to write that in C or a lower level language, C++ or something like that, because it's going to compile down to assembly and that will further protect it. But reality, reversers, I mean, we do C, C++, and it's almost a native language, just like .NET or Java is to us. So it's really easy for us to see that, to see what's going on in those compiled binaries. And so whenever we see a trick like this, we're like, oh, they're using native binaries to perform password-related functions or crypto-related functions. It's almost like a look here, like there's going to be good stuff here. So it almost works to their disadvantage because it tells us right where to look for some good things. And so I did just that as I took their assembly binary and started reversing it. You can see that they have a few functions that they export, like get mobile password, get password for serial number, get public password. And all these functions do is call down to this native function, which will compute a MD5 of a string they built. Here they build a string based on a serial number and that in-phase energy with the alternating caps case. They compute an MD5, and then they do a cute little CRC of that MD5 hash, which makes like a 6-character CRC of that hash. And that 6-character CRC is what then eventually gets compiled back up to the mono application as the password. So this function right here initially just shows me how their password is generated. And as long as I know the serial number, I can compute the password, the installer password for any device. Now, I'm going to just shelf that for right now because we'll see that this is kind of a systematic issue with this vendor, and not just this vendor, but a lot of vendors where they kind of do their own thing in creating a password or a crypto, and it ends up hurting them in the end. So we'll get back to this issue. Another thing I found inside those mobile apps is where their firmware images are downloaded from and installed on the device. And that is a S3 bucket in AWS. So I started poking at that S3 bucket and found that the permissions are open for read. I could read everything hosted on that bucket, which means I can see all their firmware images. I could also see some install scripts. I could see an XML file outlining which firmware images are appropriate for which devices and what models they have. So I was able to glean a lot of information by this open S3 bucket. And this is a issue that we see all the time. We do a lot of cloud pen tests, and although open buckets are not as common as they used to be, a lot of misconfigurations are common still, especially with IoT when they start to use like Cognito for authentication or Shadow IT to push settings down to IoT devices. It's really difficult for vendors to get the permissions and the policies on those cloud packages just right. And so this is a large issue that we often see with vendors. Now, if you look at this screenshot, you can see that all the packages end in this EEPKG extension, or at least all the firmware images end in that extension. And so I thought I had the firmware images in hand, but it turns out that extension is really their own custom encryption. So all these files have been encrypted, and I didn't have the decryption key. I wasn't able to decrypt those files. Also on the drive, I saw some scripts which referenced that decryption routine. And you can see on that screenshot there on line 771, they're calling this program called EECrypt. I don't know what EECrypt is. I couldn't find any public information about it, but apparently it is a binary that lives on the firmware image that is able to decrypt the other firmware images. So here, this is a huge win for them. I thought I had firmware images, but they're encrypted still, right? That's further protection for them. And I'm left with a catch-22 chicken the egg type problem. To decrypt the firmware images, I need this EECrypt tool, which is found on the firmware images. So at this point, I've kind of gotten stuck. I've got as far as I can go as a open source development, and I need to start looking at attacking the devices themselves. So I went to eBay. I found myself one of these devices on eBay, pulled it and bought the device and started taking it apart. Here's an image of the main PCB of that in-phase IQ device. And over the overview here, if you'll look at it, there's kind of a line in the silk screen on the PCB that divides the board into two halves. The lower left half is the high power area, which is connected to the solar panels, which is connected to your output, to your 110 or 220 phase power on your house. And then the top right side is where the low power, the embedded system is running. And here it's the main processor is there in the center, the TI AM335X chip, the system on a computer chip. It is your main processor with some external SD RAM. It's got a eMMC memory for its external. It's basically if you're not familiar, eMMC memory is like an SD card basically, right? Like that's where the ext3 or ext4 file system resides. So that's where the Linux kernel is. That's where the file system that it reads from is located. They also have this custom in-phase energy chip. I was able to find very little information on that, but it appears to be used for computing the power consumption, power production, and then reporting that information over to the TI AM335 chip. And then over on the right, you can see its JTAG interface, there's a UART interface, there's also a Wi-Fi chip and Ethernet. So those are the attack avenues that I would have available. Wi-Fi and Ethernet for software attacks, and JTAG and UART for hardware attacks. Not to mention any other traces or anything that we can pick up on. So I might come back and reference this slide as we go on, but that's just kind of overview of the chip and the system itself. And so as a device, as an embedded system attacker, there's multiple ways or multiple avenues that we can attack. And they're typically all take place at some level or a point or another at the boot process. And so this is kind of an overview of how any generic embedded Linux system boots. And what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about each step and what kind of attacks are available at each level. And then I'm going to start this at the bottom and work my way backwards. So I'm going to start down at the root system and slowly work my way back up. It might seem a little confusing at first, but I think that makes the most sense because it starts with what most people are familiar with and then slowly backing up from there. So we'll start down at the root file system. This is basically when the machine is up and running, right? This is what most people are used to seeing 90% of the time is the machine's running. So you've got all the services that it runs. Maybe it's running SSH or it's HTTP, or if they're still running Telnet, all those are the attack surfaces available. Additionally, hardware attacks at this point are you want to attach to the UART interface and see what's there. It used to be very common that you could attach to the UART and you'd be presented with a root console. That's become less common as embedded device vendors have improved their security posture, but it's still common enough that it's definitely worth at least checking. And then I also list here JTAG/SWD attacking. That, although I list it here at this stage, JTAG/SWD is really attackable at any time as soon as the processor's running. But I'm going to list it here because that's where you see it, right? You want to attack it and the machine's already on. You just connect to that interface. You try to interrupt the processor and start reading memory or register straight from the processor. That is an attack that also used to be very common, but as embedded system design has improved, processors have started to include capabilities to disable this. Maybe they can do a firmware burn that prevents it from being re-enabled, or it's a setting inside the flash that just disables it. But that is becoming very common to disable, and both those in this particular case were disabled. The UART, I could read output, but I could not, it would not accept any input. So I couldn't press enter, I couldn't log in or anything. And then the JTAG/SWD was disabled on this chip, so I was not able to interface with that. Well, I needed to look higher up at the next level, and that's like the Linux boot process. Anybody who's familiar with the Linux boot process, this should sound pretty familiar to you, but the Linux kernel is going to boot itself up, and you can influence that maybe by the parameters that are passed to the Linux kernel, or if you can boot it into like single user mode, maybe there's a shortcut key. If you can interrupt that in any sort of way, then you want to be able to get some of root console before it gets to its full boot process. That would, to attack the kernel while it's booting though, that requires some kind of input method. Sometimes the UARTTY console isn't disabled until the final run level. So maybe it's enabled during the early boot and you can press a key to interrupt the boot and then change things before it's disabled. Maybe you want to change the run level. In this case, the UART was disabled from the get-go. I could watch the boot process, which allowed me to gain some kind of information, but nothing that helped bring down the system. Another thing that's worth mentioning here is glitching. So if you're not familiar, glitching is where you'll attack some of the exposed data lines on the PCB. So example is the Linux kernel's running on the embedded chip system, but the ext file system's on that external eMMC chip, right? So if you tied maybe the I/O line between the processor and the eMMC chip to ground, then when the kernel tries to load or mount the external file system, it's going to fail because it can't read that chip. And then your hope here is that the kernel will then go into like a safe mode, right? It'll kind of say, oh, I can't mount the root file system, and just drop you out a prompt and say, what do you want to do now? And then at that point, you could end your glitch on the data line so it can then work and then manually mount the file system and then run whatever attacks you have there because you've got a console now, right? You basically glitch it in a way to prevent it from doing something and hope that it falls back in some kind of safe mode. That did not work against this processor. The kernel would quickly go to a panic, and that's really the right response, right? When you're designing embedded systems, you know the specific hardware, what you expect to see. And so any variation from that is something's gone wrong or something's not right, and you need to panic. That's the right response. If it's not how you expect it to be, there's no point in half booting or trying to recover. You should just, in an embedded system, you can't count that as a faulty device and prevent the boot panic. And that's what they did here. So that's a win for them, which means I need to go then up another level and start looking for other attack methods. So in embedded systems, there's typically what's called a second level bootloader, and its whole purpose is to bring the Linux kernel, find the Linux kernel, which is typically on some kind of external storage or which is written as like a ext4 or ext3 or ext2 file system, copy the kernel over into memory, and then pass execution to that kernel. U-boot by far is the most common second level bootloader used. There are others, but it's not worth mentioning. U-boot pretty much has the majority of the market share. And U-boot's very lightweight. U-boot also has its own environment variables that it uses to know where to find the Linux kernel, how to mount the EMC or the ext file system to find the Linux kernel, and what parameters do I need to pass to the Linux kernel at boot. By default, U-boot has like this 3-second window where you can interrupt it and then drop to a U-boot console where you can then change some of those settings. U-boot also has options for like reading the ext4 file system. It has options for downloading a kernel from a TFTP location. So it's very versatile, quite a little tool. But it's also fairly easy to lock down, right? You can set the environment variables to say 0-second boot delay, which means there's no interruption window. It performs like a CRC on its environment variables to tell if there's been any mucking with them or if they've been corrupted or glitching has attacked them. So you can secure that to prevent any attacks at that level. And then below the U-boot is the first stage bootloader. And this bootloader is very tiny. It's ROM on the embedded chip itself. And this is what kicks off initially. This is where, as soon as the chip's turned on, it starts here. And this code is basically just finds the U-boot kernel from wherever it is, or the U-boot loader, and loads it into memory and then jumps to it. It also may do things like initialize the chip, maybe initialize any GPIO pins, start the SPI bus, maybe do some self-diagnostics check before passing that execution. But it's very tiny and it's very small, and it doesn't know how, and it's not to read external flash, or it doesn't know how to read an ext4 file system. That's the point of the U-boot kernel. It's just very small to initially bootstrap and get things going. So it will typically find the U-boot kernel, which is on an external flash most of the time. Most of the time, the embedded system itself doesn't have enough room to fit the whole U-boot kernel in its own ROM. So it's going to look at an external flash. And it can't be the eMMC chip because the first stage bootloader doesn't know how to read ext4, right? It has to be kind of a mediary step. So it's typically a second little flash chip where the U-boot kernel lives. And so you can maybe attack that second flash chip or replace this bootloader image on the device itself. But that's kind of a dangerous attack, because if you mess this up at all, you've then bricked the device. It won't boot in any sort of form if you break it at this level. There's no earlier stage to recover from if you attack at this point. So typically don't recommend that, but it is possible. So what I was able to do at this point, like I mentioned, the U-boot chip, the U-boot kernel was loaded on an external flash chip. And so you see here in this image, that's the chip where the U-boot kernel was located. And we just put these Gator clips right on that chip, and using an external tool like a Bus Pirate or other tools. I usually use the custom chip to pull this, but you can pull the exact contents of that flash off and then read them. You can also alter them, but Flash doesn't let you change like one byte at a time. To change a flash, you have to erase the page and then rewrite that page. So there's a little bit of risk there of corrupting something, but it's a lot less risk than actually trying to reflash the chip. So I did that, and on the left side here, you can see the environment variables for the U-boot in that dump from that chip. And you can see where they've set the boot delay to 1. So all I needed to do was to change that boot delay to 5 or 3 or whatever, something longer than 0, and then reflash that chip. And the next time it boots, then it'll give me that short little window where I can press a button, interrupt the U-boot, and then once I've interrupted the U-boot, then I can go start either changing the parameters that are passed to the Linux kernel when it's loaded, or I could even start reading the ext eMMC chip itself. And so on the right, that's what I've done. I was able to inject that delay. I could boot to this U-boot console. And then at the U-boot console, the command there, I used ext for load. That was able to read the etc shadow file off of that external drive. So now that I've got the etc shadow file, you can see the root hash there. My hope was that I could just crack that hash and then SSH into the box. Truth be told, I was never able to crack that hash, but it turns out it doesn't matter, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. What I did do, though, was using the same technique. I dumped the Etsy, or not the Etsy shadow, but I dumped that eCrypt tool. I dumped that out to memory in this hex view, and then just used a little script to turn that hex view back into the binary, reverse the binary, or I could have just ran the binary inside like a QEMU emulator to use the binary to decrypt these flash images that I stole on those other slides back there a little ways. So with that, I started looking at the eCrypt tool, and sure enough, it was a self-contained tool that was able to decrypt those firmware images. What I found interesting in there is that all those images were encrypted via AES, right? So there's a shared key that should be in this binary somewhere, but the key wasn't embedded in the binary. Instead, they had this routine which would compute the key based on these 4 blocks or these 8 blocks. So on the left side, there's these 8 crypto blocks. And on the right side is the routine they used to generate the SHA-256 hash, which is then used as the AES key. And you can see here on this, they basically grab those blocks and then hash them in this weird order. So the block 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 2. They just kind of shuffle these blocks and then generate the key. And it's really kind of funny to me that they did this. I can only speculate as to why, but I believe, and this is just my speculation here, that either developers knew or had some kind of best practices that said you don't embed keys in binaries, right? Like that's a bad idea to write the AES key in the binary. So to get around that, they implemented this nice little, I don't know what you'd call this, data shuffler to generate the key. I mean, the end result's the same, right? I still know the AES key, but I feel like that this was done to meet like some check mark. I didn't encode the key in my binary. I was a good boy. I did the right thing, right? When in reality, it really makes no difference. I still know what the key is anyways. So with this, I was able to decrypt all those firmware images. And I want to point out that all the slides, right? Like we're at what, slide 18 now? My goal here is to get the firmware image, and they're keeping the firmware not publicly hosted, at least not linked to publicly, and then encrypting it really gave me a lot more trouble. I had to do a lot more steps just to get to that same point. As with other hardware devices, I can often just go to their website, find the firmware image, and then start browsing their source code. So that was a lot of protections that I had to defeat to get to the same point that a lot of in the past I've been able to get to very easily. So that's kind of a kudos to their design. But I typically love to get the firmware image because then I can start looking at the web pages that they're hosting, the services they're doing, and look for vulnerabilities in those. And sure enough, once I was able to get the firmware decrypted, it didn't take me maybe more than an hour or two to find my first CVE on the box. This is one of their scripts for upgrading. And you can see on line 92 that it calls this upgrade start Perl script, and then it passes some arguments to it. And on line 90, you can see those arguments come from command line parameter force. So basically, whatever I pass on the URL as the force query parameter, it gets parsed and thrown on the command line. There's no checking, so I can do an ampersand, I can do pipe, I can do semicolon, whatever, and I can execute whatever commands I want. So this is the first bug I found, and this is the bug that ultimately led to me having code execution on the box. So I got code execution on the box. At this point, I have a semi command, and I want to clean that up. First thing I wanted to do was change the root password so I could SSH into the box and then play around a lot more freely. I changed the password for the root user and then attempted to SSH in, and it still failed. And I was really baffled by this. Like I went and checked, like sure enough, the etc shadow file was changed, like the hash is different, but I cannot log in as root for some reason. I tried just logging in locally using that password and it failed again. So I knew it wasn't an SSH issue. It's something weird about the password. Like this made me start chasing a few different options, start looking at the firmware image to see what was going on or how the authentication was being handled. And it turns out that they had implemented their own authentication module, their PAM authentication module. So if you're not familiar, PAM is what handles all authentication on a Linux kernel. And you can write your own modules to interface with that. And they had done this, which will intercept all authentication attempts and then run it, and then it would check it against its own system and then return there. So it never actually used what was in etsy shadow. Instead, it had this own custom routine that was custom based on the type of authentication that was being done. So on the left, you see here what type of authentication it's intercepting. And on the right is one of the routines that it uses. So again, you see this get password for serial number. Basically, what that function's doing is it builds the string that's like username at enphaseenergy.com hashtag serial number of the device, computes the MD5 hash of that, and that is what is expected for the password. So that's the root user password, the hex digest of that MD5 hash. And that's bad. That's really bad in some ways. And let me tell you why. First off, you cannot change the password, right? Like I attempted to change the root user password. It doesn't matter what I try to change that to. That password is hard-coded for that device. There's no way that can be changed without completely disabling this module, which is going to break a number of those other services, because this module is responsible for not only SSH authentication, but it's also any web authentication, the mobile application authentication, the installer application authentication, all authentication that are pertinent to this device are intercepted by this module. And none of those passwords can be changed. Furthermore, each of those passwords can be calculated. Now that I know how it's calculated, all I really needed to know to get the password is the username I'm trying to log in with and the serial number of the device. So because of that, 3 different CVEs came out of that one really bad hardware design. And I had to look at this, and one of the big questions that I ask myself here is like, why? Why did they go this route, right? Why do you do this to intercept the authentication and go the separate route? And again, I can't speak for the developers, but here's what it seems to me, right? That they were trying to avoid the issue of having one password for all their devices. That would be another bad security issue, is to have one password that worked against every device everywhere. So they implemented this PAM authentication module that has a custom password for each device based on that device's serial number, which I'm sure they felt was a win, but it has all these other downsides, right? It's just like in that picture, they implemented the security thing, but didn't really consider the side effects of that, right? They met the checklist. Oh, I don't have a hard-coded password for all devices. No one password can rule them all. But instead, they have an easily calculatable password for each device. This is a problem, not as the way that this company implemented this was very unique to them, but we do see password management or security management or custom crypto done in some form or another on a lot of devices. It it very rarely looks the same, right? Like everybody comes up with their own custom solutions to this problem when I don't know why we don't just follow best practices here. At some point, somebody should have thought, maybe we're not the first one to have this issue, right? So getting off my soapbox there, continuing on, really all I needed to generate the password to compromise one of these devices is the serial number. That serial number is what is used as a secure key material for generating their key. The vendor didn't do so well at protecting that serial number. The serial number can be found in two different places on the PCB itself, both in a QR code that I've scribbled out or a serial number is just printed on a sticker up there. It's also on the back of the Enphase box itself. If that's not enough, it's also printed on the bottom of the Enphase box itself. In fact, on their website, they have pictures of the device showing the serial number of the device on their website. It's on the inside of the service panel, if that's too hard to find. And then it's also available on the outside of the shipping box. On this XML page that's publicly accessible with no authentication, on the homepage with no authentication, and then finally, just in case you missed it, all the other places, they also put it in the title bar. So all of these are extremely easy to find the serial number for any device. Many of these devices have, the one I bought didn't have this, but many of these devices, have cell phone module or cellular network modules. So some of them are directly accessible on the internet. You can find many of these devices on Shodan, and easy enough to find the serial number, and then you'd have the key to the device, right? So this is a very wormable bug, which lends itself to being built into, I don't know, whatever malware of the day or botnet of the day is out there, right? So what are we going to do with this device, right? Like, maybe it'll end up in some botnet or a DDoS tool or whatever, right? Like that's the typical thing you see of embedded devices. But there's some other options here that I want to run past you and just make you think about with solar panels. First off, for this particular vendor, there was one thing that kind of caught my eye that may be interesting. On their page, they have this option to open a connection. And when you click this button, what it does is the device has a generated OpenVPN certificate that it will then use to establish a VPN tunnel back into Enphase Energy's office in California. I never played with this tunnel, but you could take that key, pull it off the device, and then establish your own VPN tunnel into their network. I don't know what kind of access it is. Hopefully it's locked down so that you can't go enumerate their internal network. But what it does provide is when you click this, it does provide them a VPN tunnel into your network. So that's kind of a big security risk in my mind. I know a lot of particular corporations would have issue having that kind of feature where a vendor can have a VPN tunnel into their network. So that was one open issue I never really chased. But the big concern to me when I was researching the device is that about solar renewable energy credits. So what those are is that in some states, you basically can earn credits for the amount of energy you generate that's clean energy, right? And then these credits are tradable. You can sell them to other corporations that need to meet a certain clean energy standard, right? So basically, if you're able to fool the system in how much energy your solar generating, you're basically printing your own money at that point. So I took a look at this. This is their cloud component. And here you can see that I have suddenly started producing 900 kilowatts of power. And their system's quite happy with that, actually. So here it is. This is where the title of the talk comes from, right? This is if you're not familiar, this is Powerball Z. I think is about. I'm not even sure. So don't quote me on that. But yeah, you can just generate like your own power. You can edit the device to report how much power you're generating. But that's not a lot of power. Why stop there? Let's generate more power, right? 121 gigawatts. Now, I never signed up with my account for the solar energy credits. So I didn't actually get any credits, but the system happily reported how much I was generating. And I would like to hope that they have some safeguards in place to prevent, or at least to notice the anomaly of somebody's home solar panel system generating 1.21 gigawatts and shutting it down, or at least not cutting me that many credits. Then I could go trade to some vendor for lots of money. It's kind of a huge deal or a big question that possibly we need to look at with all solar vendors, right? Like this is a way that attackers or hackers could possibly generate their own money, laundering possibly. So talk kind of fast. I fit it all in. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and I'd love to answer them. But as the takeaways here, embedded security is definitely getting better. A lot of the easy wins aren't there anymore, but we still have a ways to go. There's still a lot of attacks that can be made. Like hardware attacks are being shut down, JTAG, UART access are being blocked. Glitching is still there though, so we need to keep that in mind to always fail safe, not fail open, excuse me. And I can't repeat this enough, but for some reason, it just doesn't seem to land. Never implement your own crypto routines. If you've got a problem that has to do with password management or in cryptography, you're probably not the first person to have that problem. And I'd suggest doing a little research and asking somebody else, what do you suggest we should do here, rather than come up with your own solution. They rarely work out well. And then just one more time reiterating how much encrypting, signing, and preventing access to your firmware image goes as to keeping your devices secure. With that, I'll close up. If you have ideas or things you want us to look at, we do this kind of thing for our day job. I love taking apart devices and IoT stuff and embedded systems. So hit us up. You have some questions or ideas. That's my Twitter handle. There's my email address, and that's our website. With that, thank you guys for your time. Thank you guys for listening, and I hope you have a good RSA.